Okay. Testing one, two, three. 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 One, two, three. Testing one, two, three. All righty. Time to begin. Well, welcome to another Wednesday office hour. Um, this the piece I put up today is of necessity a little longer. On the one hand, I'm not going to read it completely, and there are always, for those who are in Discord, you can see the references as and consult them yourself. Um, but the overall idea here was to go back. Was not really going back. It's clarifying what I did a couple of weeks ago in terms of talking about how deconstruction or some ideas about deconstruction are worth considering relative to trying to create a um, a heterodox or a radical political economy that can use um, quantitative or analytic techniques in order to do its research. Now, it's pretty clear that you can do it you can do it with a lot of qualitative stuff, but I think it's the quantitative elements, and particularly since um, quantum economics proposes itself as a useful tool in certain areas of conventional economics. And of course, the dominant neoclassicism is sort of assumed by some of the writers on so-called quantum economics. Now, in my paper, in the thing I put up a couple of weeks ago, I was making the comparison between econophysics, where and this analogy goes way far back, actually, the idea that the laws of mechanics as in physical science, applies because you're generally using the same kind of math, although with certain constraints, um, and economics, and that so that certain behavior, like financial markets or whatever, would have a certain consistency to it, and therefore a quantum version of that would benefit from that foundation. Now, the issue, that is there, and I introduced this in the thing I wrote, is the idea that if you consider three variants, there are many others, but three general variants, that is neoclassical, Keynesian, and Marxian, you would you need to get a sense that even though the neoclassical model is the dominant model with all of its little variations and modifications, provisos in the 21st century, we also know that it's the same methodology that gave us, the Great Recession and is currently bedeviling us with stagflation or a variety of other things as well, or at least legitimating or legitimizing the current bit of crony capitalism at work. So, with all of that being said, the issue at the quantum level, or the idea of using a quantum model, because it is a model that describes both a sort of palpable, visible set of relations, but also suggests that there's something else going on. As Einstein would call it, spooky action at a distance. And of course, I tried to weave that into the general idea of a kind of hauntology, which is what Derrida was talking about in terms of there's a specter haunting Europe, et cetera, from Marx. The point, of course, is that that's kind of using a literary model on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's quite possible to talk about a heterodox version of a quantum political economy in ways that it's not so much that it's resurrecting the kind of post-structural ideas that, Rockhill and a variety of other people are annoyed with in terms of so-called Western Marxism or non or anti-imperialist radicalism. So I'm not trying to sell or diminish the fact that class struggle, et cetera, is really important. But you'll see that in the literature. And what's interesting, if you sort of read the more recent things, like on analytic Marxism, is that that notion persists, that you have to sort of state that, well, analytic Marxism tended to support methodological individualism and by inference in some ways, because of methodological individualism, that it was against collective action or behavior. And that's not true. The point, and if you read it carefully among the people who write on this, the three or four, is that that's not what they were trying to sell. They were trying to, sort of create a better way in which you could talk about certain degrees of analysis. That is, for example, game theory. Game theory is modeled at kind of the first or toy level, is one that has simple interactions, two-person games, etc. And of course, reality is that doesn't quite occur, but it's certainly clear from an experimental point of view. It's a lot easier to sort of work this out when you have certain constraints built into it, and that's sort of the neoclassical model. So that being said, and I'm not going to rehearse, I've already done this. What I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about, there was a really good article, it's a fairly recent article, about deconstruction. It's a good technical overview of the entire philosophical set of problems or advantages of deconstruction. I think it's a really good article because it sort of summarizes in fairly clear terms and without, messing up with a lot of jargon, et cetera, And I think it identifies some of the clear elements of it that are important currently. I mean, in other words, discussion of feminism, for example, deconstruction does give a an opening or a entry point for ways in which that discussion is much more radical and more, sort of activated, more radically subjective, to use a more technical term. So deconstruction has its purposes. Most people focus on its sort of contentiousness, its focus on more immediate confrontation with sort of working through stuff, the privileging at one level of a very synchronic or a real, not ahistorical, but a more synchronic engagement with stuff. But the whole point, and that the article actually is quite good at that, is showing that, well, you could argue it from that point, but that's not really the point that Derrida was making. Jacques Derrida was saying, you know, there there are these other privileging discourses that are really problematic, and currently we have massive misogyny running our government. That's the critique of that needs to be deconstructive. And we're sort of engaging in that even up till today, where we confront people who like inflation, for example. They love inflation. Now, no one should love inflation because it means that you should pay more for stuff. But at a certain level of capitalism, inflation is really good because you're scoring a lot of money, you're accumulating more capital, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And we digress. So as we lead off here, so we're going to lead and then go to the end. The idea is we're going to talk about the meaning and significance of deconstruction in modern critical theory. Now, that's a big topic on the one hand. On the other hand, it is a methodology that, as I tried to show in my prior things, it is a gain for certain types of heterodox discourses, for radical subjectivity, et cetera. All of that comes to the fore when you think about how there's some fairly complex behavior and activities, and some of which, as I've begun to sort of work through in my own and as doing research related to this, is the idea that you sort of need to have fairly sophisticated tools, and some of them are mathematical. But it's not the math that's important, it's the basic idea that you have a complex economy, you have multiple elements that are screwing up things, and you can already see that from a neoclassical point of view, there's too much emphasis on either production or markets or certain assumptions about in the current literature, because I'm looking at this other stuff. The bias is for the market, that is sales. Sales are the measure. Sales are not a measure because it's much more complicated than that. Inventories, supply chains, all that other stuff. So if you had a quantitative model that said, well, no, your sales are sales are the measure against which you're going to run your analysis. It'll work from a numbers point of view, but it won't represent reality. And I think that that's kind of what we want to do with spooky action at a distance. So deconstruction helps us get at that idea of spooky action. So we begin with a quote from Derrida: critique always operates in view of the decision after or by means of a judgment. The authority of judgment or of the critical evaluation is not the final authority for deconstruction. That means that it's kind of contingent in that sense. Deconstruction is also a deconstruction of critique. So it does engage, as I did writing about it, in its own, its self-criticism, its autocritique. And that's really important. I mean, that's important from the looking at post-structural stuff, because it incorporates that which the idea of autocritique or self-criticism obviously problematic from one point of view, from in terms of pathological activity. But if you look at the history of Leninism or Maoism, you see that self-criticism is actually a key element in trying to organize collectively and operate, in terms of party building and of course, in the more serious or the more perhaps insidious version of democratic centralism, that can be problematic. And people do that. Struggles, on jokes about struggle sessions, but the reality is the struggle sessions can be actually quite insidious and problematic for all kinds of other and pathological for certain kind of reasons. So that's kind of what goes on in current Marxian discourse. Anyway, which does not mean that all critique or all criticism is devalued. In other words, if you deconstruct critique by doing deconstruction, that's kind of a regress, right? But it's important to note that one is trying to think what the authority of the critical instance signifies in history. Now, lest you think that that's unimportant, the fact is there are a variety of complex histories at work. And you can see this currently with the current administration trying to retcon, trying to do a revisionist history of absolving criminals of their crimes and erasing facts from various things, and as if that would be the final authority. All it does is reveal that some people are trying to cover up or anyway, obstruct justice and a variety of other things. All right, so I began with this little quote from Derrida, but what it's more important is to integrate it with some key and I would assert traditional, or you could call it foundational, a core sort of beliefs relative to Marxist theory. That is, and it's not just Marx. I mean, Marx gets it from Hegel, but the idea of subsumption, which, if you've been listening to me for a while, subsumption is a very key element in trying to figure out all of these other integrated relations. That is, trying to work out the labor issue, or so-called labor wedge, and the idea of constructing value and running the usual stuff, class struggle, et cetera, and looking at exploitation at all. The point being, of course, is that subsumption is a key way in which you can talk about the interrelations of value formation. The problem, if you look at it simply from a neoclassical point of view, or in some versions of a classical and, of course, Keynesian, you begin to focus on price as a means by which you can get a value. Well, the reality is, of course, that price, is it why you have data that tells you about price. The reality is that it's highly variable and problematic, and we know this just simply by being in real life. That you see loss leaders, clearance sales, other things. You can know that the range is quite weird and broader. So if you're trying to build things off of price data, that'll get you something, but it won't get you a point at which you see the conflicts in value, et cetera, which is the sort of problem of the manipulation that we saw during the Great Recession. So if you look at Michael Hudson's work, he raises this question in very specific cases. And in fact, the Great Recession still is worth looking at from that point of view. That is, that yes, you could get real paranoid and say, well, from an agency point of view, you only had a couple of people who essentially screwed up the entire thing and caused the Great Recession. And then, of course, you have the alternate discourse that says, well, it just got out of control and too big to fail and blah, blah, blah. And yes, that's quite true too. But the point is that doesn't absolve, agency in that particular context. You always have, agency and structure at work and to assess the ontological issues. That is the question of what is it that people believe. and how is it that people, construct their subjectivity. So anyway, see, I only own the first page, but let me go to the end here, because I've included, crap, what happened here? Jesus H. I don't know what's happened here. Wait a second. This is that problem of just sort of pressing buttons that, often. Anyway, the reason why it was scrolling to the end is this is a very large file, so that's kind of why it did what it did. Let me see if I can get back to it. Um, I apologize for this. No, that's not it. Man, I can't do anything without the text. So something happened on the site on which this is being built, and the worst case scenario is that I will go to my backup site. So hang in there for a second, folks. I don't know why it's doing this. Shoot. All right. Let me quit share and come. Let me unpause this and let me get this back again. Well, I thought I even screwed myself in that score. Hang in there. Hang in there, folks. I don't know why the Medium site went south on me. I don't know. It just got jammed up. And I go back to the other site, and Christ. It's a very large file, so it has to sort of open up. So I think, the point I was trying to make is that we had to go to the end of the file to sort of look at stuff. And what I've included is an article on analytic Marxism. That's a fairly recent article, and it sort of identifies or rehearses the complaint about analytic Marxism, that it wasn't class oriented enough. And actually, I think it actually shows that it is more more oriented that way. Still not coming. The Medium site is for somehow screwed. So, all right. Now I'm trying to get this. So the article that is at the end of the file, and if you have the file in front of you, you can see it, is a file that discusses logic methodology, rational choice Marxism, and the fate of bourgeois Marxism, which is essentially the critique that people like Rockhill are making, that, oh, it's just, bourgeois stuff, that's the reason why, some of this is still available, popular, problematic.
And I just posted the link to the chat. It was working for me, so you might want to try that link to.
I put it in chat. I have the link. It's just it's not posting, or it's not coming. Don't know why. I mean, I can always talk about the. Here we go. Jesus, H in a basket. All right. Finally, I'm sorry. I went to my website to look at the backup version I have of this. The point is, of course, that there's a fairly recent article. It discusses the largely methodological issues. It does rehearse some of the philosophical issues, particularly underlying the charge against analytic Marxism, often referred to, and particularly, for example, in this case, note that this is a 2023 article, and this is not a favorable article, but the guy did his dissertation on analytic Marxism, so it's like it may have just sort of the way he chose to do this was to sort of position himself as sort of not an acolyte or a heretic relative to, and of course referring to rational choice Marxism, which is one way in which you look at it historically. But the problem is rational choice is not really what it's about. I mean, you could say it from one or two of the folks who are more oriented towards methodological individualism, but I think once you get down to looking at the literature itself, you can see that they hadn't gotten rid of any particular revolutionary potential or whatever. They were, sharpening the tools, as they say. So, but let me read the front end of this, and we can sort of get to it from there, because the current discourse in critical theory addresses some of these issues. That's Rockhill's complaint, among others. And you can see that people have kind of circled the wagons or done other things that require us to rethink certain ideas, particularly on the issue of capital, the demand question, that's Mosley's issue. And then ultimately, as I've tried to point out in some other ways, is to think about that you can have a mathematical model that kind of really helps this whole business out. And once you sort of figure that out and show that it's not that complicated, that it actually can be used to assess certain issues, and you can sort of move forward from there. So anyway, that's a kind of an apology for that. And I apologize for losing us for a couple minutes there. So at the end of the 20th century, as postmodernism achieved hegemony in academic and social science discourse, a new Marxism emerged from within academic Marxism, declaring itself a radical departure from traditional Marxism. Even that claim is questionable, and particularly when you look at Jerry Cohen's work on it. Cohen is not saying, this is new. Rather, Cohen was saying, the logic of historical materialism just sort of needs to be re-examined and looked at in a more analytic way. That's all. That's really truly the reason to look at that, and not any other kinds of reasons. So it joined the fierce debates over structural and Althusserian Marxism, which is what I was talking about last week with Rick Wolf's work and entry points and all that other business. Um, that doesn't give it the full attention that it needs. You have to look at the ideology questions and a bunch of other things. But the fact is, these are not radical departures. Ultimately, as if you read enough Althusser, you can see, no, he's just sort of trying to clean up some stuff, like Lenin, etc. That he's actually providing us better ways in which we can think about a 19th century philosophy in the 20th century context. And Althusser was actually sort of, as I've said before, Marx was didn't complete his work. There's a lot of aporia, the gaps in Marx's writings that need to be sort of filled in. That are big questions that were part of Marx's sort of working through the problem. That is, questions about ground rent, for example. Not that Althusser talks about ground rent, but that there are other issues they're kind of still there, like the neo-Ricardian stuff, et cetera. And unless you think that's unimportant, you'll see certain in the literature. Well, anyway, in the stuff I've been looking at, we're back to Ricardianism at certain moments. So it rejected humanist and existential Marxism and much of the Frankfurt School Marxism. And, people are drawing borders, et cetera, et cetera. But as I point out here today, or somewhere in this text, is even the economists within Frankfurt School Marxism, Pollock, for more specifically, he still has a purpose. And his analysis is one that we should not forget. I mean, Pollock gives us, if he gives us anything relative to Frankfurt School Marxism, he gives us this sense of that, well, the state is still important and corporatism is also important. And it's kind of the front end to when you get to Althusser talking about ideological state apparatuses, but that's far ahead. So it sought, that is analytic Marxism, to compel Marxists to live up to their claims about being scientific, subjecting their claims, as it were, to rigorous logical analysis and proposing alternatives to Marxist methodology, including methodological individualism, standard logic, modal logic, that's a whole nother thing, and rational choice / game theoretic modeling. More than anything, it is a brazen attempt to make Marxism into quote unquote normal social science, denuding it of its radical character. Now this is I hate to call this a reactionary claim, but it's a reactionary claim. I mean, if you're looking at this from a more Althusserian point of view, you're just, you have to say, no, it's a little more pluralistic. You have to sort of think about it's important to assess or evaluate radical subjectivity. And one way in which you assess it is to look at, why are certain evolutionary problems not fully addressed? And that's kind of, Bowles and Gintis sort of thing, is that it's not about two-person game modeling as it is looking at the iterative elements, that is, that it unfolds from an evolutionary game theory point of view. And that's still necessary. You still need to look at this historical past stuff. And you don't lose that, or you don't negate it when you start dealing with huge, like Steve Keen's structural dynamics analysis and stuff. It looks problematic because it's got, numbers and charts and graphs and big data. But the reality is it's still got a micro problem built into it that, a lot of people just don't work through. And that's why Minsky's still important in that particular context, and Kalecki, et cetera. So it's not denuding Marxism. And making Marxism into a normal social science is actually, from a political point of view, really important. It is why Marxism, or things that are, that's why some economists still call themselves post-Keynesian, because if they started talking about Marx too much, they'd get in big trouble with reactionaries on their, in your faculty or whatever. And lest you think that's unimportant, all kinds of crazy crap has happened in that, in the name of, whatever methodological disagreements, etc. It's why the Amherst School was created, essentially during a purge of left economists at Harvard. Now, some of them stayed at Harvard. Certain people who were clearly emigres and actual very close to being real Marxists, but they tended to, in the midst of sort of an anti-communist surge and a bunch of other things, it didn't have the same vitality. And so you had this small group of folks who wound up either going to Amherst, to the University of Massachusetts, or who, stayed in their own, bailiwicks, the New School or Yale or some other place. So, and some other people, went off to very crazy places. So anyway, more than anything, it is a brazen attempt to make Marxism into a normal social science. It's just foolish to make that claim. But anyway, its principal theorists named their school analytical Marxism. It has been referred to as rational choice or game theory Marxism. Now, all of that is, on the one hand, right on, in terms of labeling, branding it, but you've got to take it with a sort of a sense of humor, because some of these people who are analytic Marxists, when they got together, they referred to themselves. This is a small anecdotal side thing, and it's actually mentioned in the literature. But then, at some moment, they just referred to themselves as the no bullshit Marxism, and which, it's a kind of reactionary element, but that it is part and parcel of academic politics. So, diminishing Marxism in order to allegedly clarify it is a bold yet failed effort. Now, I would assert that's wrong. It hasn't really truly failed. It's just, metamorphosed into some really interesting new areas of concern, like Romer on distributive justice, and as I just mentioned, Bowles and Gintis, or Bowles, on evolutionary game theory. And there's a whole new way of thinking about this stuff that doesn't, in fact, indulging those points of view makes it not so normal from a social science point of view. It actually, puts it out in some interesting areas that still need to be worked on. For example, there's a whole body of literature, or because the critique of neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, that would assert, and this is oversimplifying it, that there's a kind of social ontology sort of argument that can be made. Now, the reality, of course, is that at some moment you actually have to start building empirical models and start actually doing work on it, but it kind of hasn't gotten there yet for whatever reasons. So it's a turn from class analysis. That's not true. It's just not true. The fact is that class analysis has always been a part of this. So if you look at a couple of the folks who are fellow travelers of this, they do work on social division, as opposed to, more specifically, Elster is about methodological individualism, but that's kind of a pejorative way of looking at it, because it's only one element of looking at the model. And it's much bigger than that, and it needs to be obviously scaled in a different way. But anyway, that's another story. The exploitation of labor and other foundations of Marxism replaces the working class and class collectivities with the quote-unquote rational agent of liberal social theory. Now, I would assert that that's one way of arguing it, particularly when you talk about rational choice. But the reality is, you're just, you're talking about a certain level, or you're talking about scalar issues where there are microeconomic implications or micro foundations to talk about macro activity. And without going back to, was it Weintraub or whatever, this is a point that remains in the standard neoclassical model. Um, it's not about presuming rational agent, although obviously there's this thing called rational expectations. But the reality is, of course, some of the people who are support that idea would actually probably agree that their irrational agency is actually more important. The move to, as they claim, separate Marxism from its inherent functionalism and teleology is but a veil to justify turning Marxism away from working people and toward the petty bourgeoisie. See, what you have here is the same critical argument about the professional managerial class, right? And this goes back to Aaron Bach and a whole bunch of other folks, and more recently, Catherine Liu. Um, uh, you know, uh, that's one way in which you can talk about it in terms of class fractions. But the point is that it's not, that there are functional elements that have been part of the Marxian model. They've always been there, and they're very problematic. And in fact, you could argue that there's some very nasty versions of Marxism that were purely functional, and lots of horrible things happened because of its functionalism. Um, as well as the teleology, which is kind of the thing that we see in this Rockhill critique of the Frankfurt School. Anyway, from radical and revolutionary concerns to working class subordination to ruling elites. See, it doesn't necessarily take that away from that. In fact, if you look at certain arguments about how um, the way certain things are modeled, it actually is very useful because it can engage. And I think that's where I it's not clear to me. I should have a conversation with Romer about this, but that why people had issues with certain components of his version of analytic Marxism. And as I've mentioned before, one of the critiques was, well, from a mathematical point of view, he wound up showing that under socialism, people would still be exploited, and that shouldn't be, you know, controversial, but some people took it too literally and created all kinds of other issues. So anyway, Elster, Wright, Brzezinski, Cohen, and Romer, and a couple of people have died already. So I don't think there's anyone picking up the torch. But the fact is, of course, the guy who wrote this article wrote his dissertation on it. So whatever. Others have carried out analytical and social science experiments using its approaches. I will focus primarily on Elster, Romer, and Wright. G.A. Cohen is something of an outlier in the project and should be approached differently. You see, already that screws up, your, sort of arguments for normal social scientists, because Cohen is actually, uh, you can't have analytical Marxism without Cohen on the one hand. On the other hand, there are different goals that each of these people in this school have engaged, and the reality, of course, is that it never fully gets, there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no analytical Marxism journal, just to give you an example of institutionally how this works. So all of this sort of claiming that it's monolithic is always stupid. But needless to say, it doesn't stop people from writing these kind of articles. This essay deals solely with analytical Marxists as a group of Marxist theorists and academics. It does not deal with the sociology of the formation of this group of academics, what in sociology is called a quote unquote theory group. Even that notion has its own other issues, and that should be left to sociology, the issues in sociology about theory formation and whatever. As a theory group, analytical Marxists are profoundly interesting as they manifest the conditions of modes for achieving academic success. They're careerists, whatever. All of these folks are full professors, whatever. So, take that as you will. The theory is as much a reflection of issues that go far beyond theory and include world political movements, global ideological relationships, and possibilities for academic success within late capitalist academic realities. There should be a book on late capitalist academic realities. Anyway, these questions were explored in my PhD dissertation, Analytical Marxism, Theory Formation in a Time of Turbulence. As if we're not currently having this issue. The reason why I bring all this up is that we're still in a theory formation problem. As I tried to introduce this idea of a quantum political economy, this is theory formation at its probably at its best. And the point I make in using this one particular article, which is only a couple of years old, is to show that we're still bogged down in kind of accusations, making people outliers, whatever. And it needs to move a little further. And this is why, and I think it's a good article. I'm not trashing this person specifically, because he does end with a consideration of how artificial intelligence, AI, and game theory is deployed within Marxism. Now, even conjoining those two is problematic, but that's another story. And how it might be a fatal blow. This is revisionism at its best. How it might be a fatal blow to academic Marxism and revolutionary politics among university-trained people. Well, that's pretty monolithic. I don't think it does that. You'd be hard pressed to show that it did that, because you actually don't have the army of graduate students produced by these 4 or 5 folks. And yes, you could, be even more deconstructive about it, because there are no, in this context, there are no women or people of color in the constitution of this theory group. So that's a whole nother set of issues. But that's why you would need to take a deconstructive point of view on this, because in fact, that's what happened. There isn't an army of DEI, political economists that came from this school. So obviously it has other privileged issues. So in political and ideological terms, this project might be deployed to frame current debates about libertarian socialism and libertarian communism. Yes, it might be, but that may not, that's a fool's errand. Analytical Marxism's appearance of theoretical sophistication possibly appeals to young thinkers, Gen Z, I suppose, drawn to both the working class and communism. I will try to show the philosophical and theoretical consequence of this epistemic strategy within Marxism as perhaps a warning to those who might mistakenly assess its sophistication with its actuality. So on the one hand, we have revisionism. On the other hand, it's being retconned in that particular way. So anyway, I won't rehearse this, but he does. I think he does a good job of identifying the kind of underlying theoretical issues. And so, we get a listing of the components: methodological individualism, rational choice / game theoretic modeling. Number 2, the centrality of the rational individual to social explanation. Now, I would assert that that's not, that's not wholly endorsed by any of these people other than Elster, but that's, I find generalization problematic in his reasoning. But anyway, logico-methodological eclecticism, including modal logics, mathematical and statistical methods. Damn it. Come on. And linguistic analysis. You see, that's the linguistic analysis thing is actually quite interesting, because, that's why deconstruction is important. Why I've been, staring at and not subscribing to, but using it as sort of a useful, sort of cautionary tale, or kind of an interesting peripheral look at Saussure and Charles Sanders Peirce. But the point is that, for example, semiotics has its own issues about problematic elements, etc., and it is problematized, in fact, by the relationship between it and deconstruction, for example, and yet if you look at the literature more closely, that it's not as problematic as one might think. Although I'm sure that Derrida probably referred at many points to semiotic as a totalizing discourse or something. Anyway, non-revolutionary and positive social science. Now, already this is pejoratively problematic. Is what counts as a revolutionary and or non-revolutionary positive social science? Because in some ways that's just kind of normal. That's normal social science. So anyway, a political practice of social democracy and libertarian socialism. So the implication, of course, and the methodological individualism stuff follows the problematic elements of Mies and Hayek, who fully endorse methodological individualism, and it would be really problematic to claim that Austrian economics and its fellow travelers are anywhere better at this than anyone else, or to tar people who really truly do believe that they are still doing Marxian radical work as weakening their position by indulging in the same things that these very super conservative, the right wing people believe in. So it's very problematic. So I treat the choices of logic by analytical Marxists as the plumbing and groundwork of the project. It's Grundrisse. It is therefore necessary to understand their understanding of the purposes of logic itself. At the end of the day, I locate its approach to knowledge and its logical apparatuses within that 20th century movement called logical empiricists. Now, even that's a bad move too, but we get a big argument about that because it doesn't quite do that either. But anyway, I will explicate logical imperialism through the logical works of John Stuart Mill, William Whewell, Bertrand Russell, and Rudolf Carnap. Now, in doing so, I hope to lay bare what is going on in and among analytical Marxists. I will conclude with what I call AI Marxism, that is algorithm-driven Marxism. So already, it's off the rails. I mean, I don't even understand what that would mean for all reasons. But that it's just I don't think it's wrong-headed so much as it is misguided. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so the article moves on. There's all kinds of stuff in it. It ends with a commentary on this trying to combine the enemy in all in one place, which is its own issue, have some set of issues. So where could all this lead? Logics and possible worlds theorizing, along with rational choice / game theory modeling, suggest an avenue for AI, artificial intelligence, as a tool of class analysis. Rational choice Marxism, as identified by analytical Marxists, suggests that the class struggle is no more than negotiations between competing interest groups, the workers and capitalists. It's just an oversimplification. In this conceptualization, most outcomes are compromises and suboptimal. Well, yeah, that's probably true. AI is used as a logical tool in order to predict the class struggle. I don't know where. I don't even see where that happens, and I don't think there's a literature for it. But that's kind of this weird thing about this article. Here, the notion of predictability is based on the idea that billions of rational agents' actions are predictable through proper algorithms. Well, they aren't, and there's a whole logic to AI algorithms that is poorly conceived. Let's put it that way. Rather than the class struggle generally understood, we have the actions of billions of rational agents acting to achieve personally satisfying outcomes, albeit most times suboptimal outcomes. The working class of individuals without durable class interests. Their interests are first and primarily individual and can be explained where individuals are idealized as rational agents. We're almost to the end of this. AI and sophisticated algorithms, while imitating human intelligence, I mean, that's the difference between LLMs and AI is, the question of, anthropomorphizing the question of knowledge. But anyway, operate on the assumption of the separation of consciousness from intelligence and sets aside the notion that intelligence and even rationality are social constructs. Now, I don't see any place where it does that, but it's sort of an interesting claim. Furthermore, the various logics and the relationship to knowledge and science in certain construals can be deployed in one or another use of AI. I don't even think we're close to that. And I think it's wrong-headed anyway, so I agree with his, sort of negative assessment of AI and this sort of stuff. But it doesn't mean that we can't be, sort of conversant and actually address it a little bit more closely, more analytically, so to speak. The practice makes Marxist analysis into an apolitical, technocratic collecting and analyzing of data and leads to predicting outcomes in non-political ways. What is apparent is that class analysis is separated from class struggle. That's always the complaint about analytical Marxism, and clearly it's without going too far into it, this Rockhill kind of comes from that, and I understand that is much more sophisticated relative to French theory, etc. So, but anyway, Marxist intellectuals are separated from the working class. The working class turns out to be but a fiction, inverted by petty bourgeois Marxists and academics, for whom the working can never be a class for itself and will never be conscious of itself as a collectivity, as a class. Now, these are really interesting claims, but I don't think you can apply them to analytical Marxism. What analytical Marxism is doing is trying to hone certain elements and leaving it available, which I would assert is what it does, and what various practitioners are doing, is leaving it available for more rigorous historical materialist analysis. But that's just me. I'm probably just being an apologist. But it does seem to me that you can't sort of, I mean, this is not a viable claim here that they're really against this, and that class analysis goes out the window. Well, that's not true. When you look at E.O. Wright's work or whatever, it's not. The class struggle is still there. Anyway, however, what is Marxism without a politics of revolutionary change? It ceases to be Marxism. This is the bottom line for some folks. Or at least the Marxism conceived by Marx and his followers of all stripes. And here is the rub. Academic Marxism, already suspect because of their disengagement from people, reaches its apogee with analytical Marxism, rational choice Marxism. Well, it may have reached an apogee, but it doesn't mean that, there's a whole bunch of other things that go on that, while you might not call them rational choice, there certainly is an underlying set of not so much rational choice issues, but certain modeling or structural issues that so evade. I mean, I think you could argue that Anwar Sheikh does that, or the new Duncan Foley, et cetera, that well, anyway. Not only is it apolitical and anti-revolutionary, but it fits all the conditions of academic social science across the board. It is then that a Marxism that serves the capitalist classes and argues and presents a strategy of working class struggle that turns out to be but a negotiation with ruling elites. See, I don't think any of the analytical Marxism literature makes that claim. It's a conclusion you could draw from it, but I don't think they make any claims of, well, we've got to capitulate or negotiate with ruling. That just doesn't look like, it doesn't appear in this kind of work. But then again, maybe and above. I don't think he proves it, but that's another story. On the other hand, it fits with a type of labor aristocratic leadership of trade unions. Yes, it does, but so does a lot of other things. So, on the other hand, it fits with a type of labor, blah, 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 presenting themselves, especially when the logics and algorithms tied to AI are deployed, as technically competent strategies of the working class. They can foist upon working people and their leaders reformist strategies and programs. So this is the closing paragraph. This essay focused on the logical choices and consequences of analytical Marxism, showing that more than what they say, it is the choice of methods and logics that predict what the trajectories and uses of this project might be. So, ultimately, this, with all due respect, this is kind of a straw argument. But anyway, the future of analytical Marxism is as a part of AI, modal logic, and game theory, and against the working class. Its practitioners end up somewhere between libertarian socialism and libertarian communism, consigned to a corner somewhere in the academy where all the dustbins are, in a discursive space where they attempt to engineer the struggle and preach reformism and quietism to working people. See, I don't think it ever tried to do any of that. And as I said, this I think is a straw argument. Not a positive fate for what at the start was celebrated as a new species of theory. So, without getting too crazy about this, and this argument is replicated, needless to say, there's an earlier argument, Nature, Society, and Thought, which is a really good journal. There's other issues here. You can talk about, so that's back end of this. So at the front end of my little fiddling around with this is to talk about that this, because I'm not arguing in favor of analytical Marxism. I am speaking in favor of more thoughtful analytical examples and models that can address what I think will be the territory, the terrain of contention, because AI does need to be. I think AI is fine. It's been there for decades. The issue is the proliferation of LLM models and the laziness or the inability to provide of even the front end of this problem. So I'll give you an example, a very concrete example. So I was fiddling around because I've been looking at certain connections between what may appear to be more humanist approaches or more non-mathematical approaches. So I asked the AI, my particular AI, to deal with this. What are the implications of trying to talk about it in this way? Now, what I got was in the first instance, what you're saying is problematic, irrelevant, and nonsensical, or whatever. I mean, it gave me a very conservative, reactionary foundation. But then when I started adding follow-up questions, so for example, just to use a quantitative example, although it could be subject to the same arguments that we see here against analytic Marxism. But he was never an analytic Marxist, although he is clearly, anti-economics. I mean, he's an economist, but he hates the entire apparatus, that is Steve Keen's work, Keen, and he has a whole set of other issues that are really good and worth reading about, and he shows very analytically, but he's never been called an analytic Marxist, even though what he does is ostensibly what analytic Marxism had always hoped to be, and that is to literally destroy the class underpinnings of the profession. But anyway, so all I did was mention a clarifying example by using Keene as an example, particularly on his issue of talking about structural dynamics, etc. And the LLM went totally different. It sort of said, "Well, no, that's you know, you have a good idea here." You know, when it first in the first cut, it totally trashed my idea. And then once I sort of put in this one little element, and it's almost name dropping, the whole argument shifted around, and it became very useful for me. It pointed me in the right direction in talking about certain advanced mathematics and some other stuff. And it you know, on the one hand, it forces me to do more math. On the other hand, it puts me in a situation where I can see now, and without and to not rely, of course, on an AI, but also to rethink some of these underlying questions that are kind of easy throwaway things. Yeah, you know, it's the petty bourgeoisie. Yeah, of course, but you know, there's more to it than that. And to divide certain historical things to, you know, that essentially it's libertarianism of one kind or another, undercuts the kind of notion that you really actually want to look at it much more closely. Look at the epistemic issues, look at the progression, for example, in deconstruction that moves, you know, or why is Heidegger important to Derrida? I mean, that's in the article I've included in here. That's actually an important point. But the other important point, if you're really into deconstruction, is to, you know, and I don't think Derrida ever does that. You know, there must be. He must have written about it somewhere. But Heidegger's later position on late modernism, technology, and the Nazis. um, I'm sure he wrote about it somewhere. But anyway, so the other article that I begin this with is to talk about subsumption. And I picked a particular article because it has Kantian front end issues. And with all due respect to our little trashing of analytical stuff, the Kantian sort of component here is the same one that John Romer has done in recent work. And it's not the same one, but it is addressing from a Kantian direction some of these kinds of issues. And they're not trivial matters. And they're clearly at the center of, you know, class analysis or whatever. But anyway, so a putative theory of subsumption was thereby seen to offer the key to grasping not only the objective path of capitalist development, but also subjective programs of resistance to it, thus uniting the configuration of conditions from within which revolution must emerge. You see, the other article on analytic Marxism claims that it's being, you know, sort of reactionary or anti-revolutionary, when in fact all it's doing is building, you know, you got to have you're still going to need gunsmiths in the revolution. So anyway, so this article is becoming subsumption, and I've included a substantial part of this, but we'll skip through that. That the front end of this Andres Sens de Sicilia, I mean, he's written some really interesting stuff, and that's for another day. Becoming subsumption, the Kantian roots of a Marxist problematic. This is also another recent article. The being of capital thus implies no rest or stasis, but rather constant becoming, constant growth, the spiraling outward of its centripetal energy, which runs up against multiple barriers. That is, the resistance of workers, the finitude of nature, even in its own destructive drive for insatiable accumulation. So, now, so within that one sentence, you have all kinds of other stuff going on. You know, social ontology, revolutionary subjectivity, all kinds of stuff is there. And there's a historical element as well, which is really, I think, also important, particularly in terms of, you know, what we're looking at earlier months ago about Lasordo's work and various versions of Italian communism, etc. So, if the becoming of value towards more value its axiomatic expansion is systematically presupposed and necessitated by capital. How does this correlate with the becoming of capital? So there's one becoming of capital, and there's another becoming of capital. Its historical becoming and anticipated eventual death. This is the withering away argument, right? That this is pure Marx. I mean, or Marxian in the sense that, eventually classless society, et cetera, as a finite form of social production. When, how, and as an effect of which, social forces will capital's reign over human life come to an end. So, this all is, highly stated, but the fact is, we haven't really left, where we were 19th century, and we've returned to it, and there's a literature for it in talking about new ways of approaching the subsumption problem. So anyway, this is an article, moderately recent, on being, becoming, and subsumption. And let me just read a couple of the front end paragraphs, but it is a way in which we can re-enter this deconstruction argument, because it's consonant with this article that I put in here on a kind of background history of deconstruction, and it's really quite good, actually, because it sort of explains the whole business without getting into left field or jargon land or whatever. So the becoming of capital as a system is thus dependent on a mode of development that is simultaneously a negation, absorption, or negotiation of inherited social relations of form, of wealth, technology, knowledge, institutions, social roles, practices, etc., and their subordination to the logic of capital's own life process. So if you juxtapose this against the critique, as we saw at the end there, of analytical Marxism, we can see that they're sort of talking about the same damn thing, and pointing towards a certain kind of set of issues that does need to be addressed, but that doesn't obviate the kind of quantitative implications of what analytical Marxism was and maybe is. But analytical Marxism is anachronistic in that sense. It's moved on. Its principal characters moved on, as it were. Some of them are dead. As first and foremost a social relation of production, Marx describes in just a few scattered fragments how capital subordinates or subsumes. And this is subsumption does have a translation issue here as well. Existing forms of production in order to configure them as capitalist valorization processes. Remember, we were talking before last week about Cuckshot on the trying to interpret valorization just because it's a translation problem. But anyway, engines of profits for their owners. As Marx outlines, this can occur formally simply through a transformation of the economic relationships involved in production, underpinned by the introduction of relations of exchange between buyers and sellers of labor power. That's just not controversial. The issue, of course, is is form. That form is the underlying problem, as in value, form, etc. But it doesn't negate the fact that there are transformations going on and that they do involve all of these sub issues. So, but subsumption under capital, Marx notes, can and does also occur in a deeper, real form, which transforms the material composition of production, that is, the techniques and technology of production, as well as the products themselves, period. Both at the economic and material levels, Marx thus identifies the mechanisms by which specifically capitalist forms of social domination come into being, transforming existing apparatuses. That's an important term here. Apparatuses of production and property relations in order to secure the extraction of surplus labor from workers in the form of surplus value. Now, that's the oversimplified version of it. And as if you've been noticing, what I've been trying to work through is, it's not as obvious, or it's more more complicated. To call it abstract implies some transcendental or epiphenomenal thing, but the fact is there are deeper abstractions when you talk about the difference between labor power, work, and all these other issues that have to do with valorization, extraction of value, whatever that might be. And it's not technically value; it's extraction of other things, labor power or time. So anyway, that needs to be squared away. These formal and real modes of subsumption, along with further hybrid forms identified by Marx, constitute mechanisms of domination, mechanisms through which the becoming of capital, the augmentation of its exploitative and transformative power over human life is achieved. This is not controversial, and in fact fits with some of the other issues we were talking about before. And, because if you're talking about domination, you can't be talking about, privileging the, petty bourgeoisie or whatever, because domination is always there. It's problematized and forms the basis in some cases for, class fractions or whatever, conflicts. So once a sufficient degree of such subsumption has occurred, once a sufficient mass of social substance has been incorporated and formed in accordance with capital's life process, then it might be said that the system is no longer simply becoming, but it has attained being, which, you can just see in that one sentence, really problematic for a lot of other things, including an analysis of AI. And famously, seems to stand upon its own hind legs independently of the human hands which animate it. Marx describes the being of capital as an organic system. That is, a system capable of reproducing its own conditions of existence, sustaining itself through a cyclical metamorphosis which passes through a necessary sequence of stages or forms regeneratively. Now, there's a lot of verbiage there, but this is kind of what Heydrich is talking about in terms of value form. So it's not. This is not anything new. This is simply trying to place it, historically in the underlying issues, Kantianism, etc. I mean, when you talk about Kantianism and Marx, I would assert that, that's problematic for a whole bunch of people, but it doesn't negate, that it's sort of there, and particularly on the issue of justice or certain types of well, anyway. So that's a continuing issue. Yet, in distinction from other organic systems, capital's peculiarity is its need to expand, to accumulate. This is the underlying point. It is the thing that drives comments about class struggle, what you're going to, you're serving the reactionary purpose of an elite, blah, blah, blah. Well, the reality is that capital peculiarity is its need to expand, to accumulate. By definition, capital cannot survive by simply reproducing itself, by regenerating itself exactly as it was when the life cycle began. It must rather, and this is, this is just what Marx talks about, whether it's volume 1 or volume 3, it must rather reproduce itself in an expanded form, is driven onwards and outwards to absorb an ever greater wealth of material that it can claim as its own through, yes, commodification, exploitation, and accumulation. Never leaves these ideas. And as much as some people looking at analytical Marxism would get, kind of irritated at, well, where's the commodity, and, you look at certain other elements of it, well, where's all the exploitation? And, there should be less exploitation if you move to socialism, which is problematic. And then, of course, the underlying issue, and that is accumulation, the whole business of capital accumulation. So the being of capital thus implies no rest or stasis, but rather constant becoming, constant growth, a spiraling outward of its centripetal, I mentioned centripetal energy, which runs up against multiple barriers. That is, the resistance of workers, the finitude of nature, even its own destructive drive for insatiable accumulation. And lest you think that's unimportant, that's kind of the current set of issues, is that, you know, central government policy in the United States is currently on a destructive drive for insatiable accumulation. The problem is, of course, that it's a class division that is doing this, and working folks are just not part of that process. In fact, well, there's a whole nother set of things. So if the becoming of value towards more value, its axiomatic expansion, is systematically presupposed and necessitated by capital, the question becomes, how does this correlate with the other becoming of capital? Its historical becoming, and anticipated eventual death as a finite form of social production. So it's this underlying set of issues that are historical materialists that constrain the argument, and that never leads to people, you know, who you would demonize as analytical Marxists. And similarly, because I'm going to close soon, it's the idea that, you know, even if you had a quantum political economy, et cetera, it would still be constrained and in important historical materialist ways about how it gets to that point. Whether it's the advanced, you know, spectral mathematics that Hilbert spaces at one end of it, and the implication of that math towards some simple things which currently appear in the literature, um, that there's an NBER article that I'll probably talk a little bit about that sort of shows that it's not an abstraction, this kind of fiddling around with this stuff. You can actually you can begin to apply this to certain degrees of stuff. And I mentioned sales before. It's the same problem. It's oversimplification, marginalizing certain things, discounting or excluding certain other ideas. So, so how is this going to come to an end? And that's kind of the commitment in one sense of how this argument moves. So let me read one more paragraph and then I'm going to stop. Subsumption has a privileged status within the Marxist conceptual apparatus because it marks the interface between capital as system and capital history. Whereas categories such as value, commodity, and capital are internal to the totality of capitalist form determinations, there's a whole thing there. Subsumption designates the point of articulation between this organic system and process and the historical substance through which it lives, which it must absorb and reform in order to exist. So, as we've seen, it is only through the subsumption of existing social forms of production that capital can emerge into being and establish itself. And even once this has occurred in its quote unquote real form, Marx insists, it continues to radically remold, quote, all its social and technological conditions through a constant revolutionizing of production. So subsumption is thus, and this gets to the core point of whether, if you're looking at this or you're looking at certain other, commentaries on, volume 1 and blah, 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 it's still, subsumption is thus the category of mediation relating the capitalist system to its external and internal foundations, which of necessity are subject to the flux of historical time. So this is that moment where, all of this, yammering about, is it normal social science? Why are you trying to do this? Is to sort of see it in its larger picture. And that is, that even though you're about, and I'm not defending rational choice as a category, because it only represents some moment in social science history anyway, but you can get to a kind of point where it always is or remains historicized. So even if you did a quantum political economy, it still would have to come under conditions of or the critique by historical materialism. It doesn't evade that. It never will. I mean, even if you go to certain philosophical positions like deconstruction, it doesn't deny or negate this historical materialist condition of under which it's being argued. So whatever is indicated by subsumption is thus that which joins capital as system to the history that it both resides within and acts upon. Now, that one sentence there describes the same thing that is going on with deconstructive processes. That is, I would assert that the subsumption describes a deconstructive moment where you're dealing with capital as a system, but also seeing it in its various, contradictions and activities. This is similar to the argument, as people have, spent far too much time trying to figure out, is, what is the nature of epiphenomenal, or the difference between tangible and intangible capital, and et cetera. So here's where the problem resides. Given Marx's rudimentary sketch of subsumption, its tentative appearance in drafts and its notes, and its failure to be integrated to the final version of capital, you see, that's one of the underlying issues. The weight it seems to bear as the principal category of mediation between capital's systematic and historical aspects is not supported by a developed conceptual framework. So this is that thing. Well, he didn't talk about it enough, so therefore it's, it lacks relevance. Well, that's the whole question of analyzing Marx, whether it's volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, is to look for the aporia, is to look for the gaps. And this is that issue. So lacking a robust apparatus of its own, the theory of subsumption has, as a result, been subordinated to two competing schemas of totality which have dominated Marxist thought: a systematic dialectic that totalizes synchronically, and a philosophy of history that totalizes diachronically. So already in this one sentence, we got right back to the issues that we saw in Saussure, and ultimately are part of the same set of issues for Derrida. That is, you have, synchronic totalizing, and a sort of a historical, as I just mentioned, historical materialism that totalizes diachronically. And so in that sense, it's a language problem in that sense. Each of these in its own way functions to disarm the revolutionary tension between the form and content of capital, between the system and its history, between the perfect ideal and imperfect materiality of exploitation. That the imperfect materiality of exploitation, that truly does describe the reason for doing deconstruction, is that, exploitation is present, but it is always a kind of imperfect materiality, and requires analyzing it, analyzing the practice, the mediating practices that go on here. So in order to reactivate this tension on the plane of theory, so that Marxism can remain operable as a discourse which tracks the movement of a dynamic and unstable system of concrete conditions which continually deform their own space of possibilities, to borrow a phrase from Giuseppe Longo, it is necessary to explore what is exactly at stake in the category of subsumption. The whole point I've been trying, the arm waving, both in its philosophical prehistory and its passage to becoming a materialist category adequate to the critique of capitalist domination. So I'll stop there, because this can get a little too hairy, but I would assert to you that subsumption at one level, because one could, I think by its very nature, it's not a totalizing discourse, is part of the way in which we can use deconstruction or deconstructive activity to re-engage or animate the kind of critique of capital. And yes, Derrida doesn't talk a great deal about it from that point of view, but as this other article sort of discusses, Derrida changes his mind about things, not radically, but in a variety of ways. So um, wherever the other article, and that's because we didn't get to it. Maybe I'll talk about it next week because I do think it's a good article and it's worth your time and energy to look at it. Is a 2020 article in the American Journal of Humanities and Social Science Research. It's an open access research paper on deconstruction theory and its background by Mawazo, Kavula, uh, Sikirivwa. Anyway, so let me read that abstract and then we can stop. This article defines and presents the meaning and significance of deconstruction in modern critical theory. It reveals the overview of deconstruction as a theory of reading text, but not wholly about, I mean, even text itself, the idea of text becomes differentiated in this argument. And there's actually a good article for that to talk about things that are intertextual. It doesn't talk about it that way, but that's what I think it leads to. And it explains the philosophical foundations of deconstructive thinking through the Derridian critique of Plato, Martin Heidegger, and Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure always shrift, I think, within the context of deconstruction Derrida. So I appreciate the fact that, there's Plato is always there for Derrida, and as is Heidegger, but Saussure is actually kind of important and doesn't get the attention, I think, in other deconstructive arguments that it should, as I tried to point out by yakking about Saussure talking about his own sense of what economics is, for example. So the article proposes also to expose how deconstruction is used in various fields of study today, asserts the philosophical status of the deconstructive theory, and assesses its contribution to knowledge in general. So it is, in that sense, a kind of a summary or truly an introduction. But I think it's very worthwhile because by the time you get down to deconstruction in architecture or deconstruction in feminist theory, you can sort of see why this thinking about it in this way has always been important. And in fact, it is, or the way in which you could describe it, to get all the way back to the beginning of where he started, is, criticizing analytic Marxism that it doesn't have revolutionary potential or blah, 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 blah. The fact is, if you practice the other areas that are implied by this late 20th century set of ideas, you actually get back to the original point, is questions about subsumption, questions about mediation, questions about critique. All those are there. And some people are wrought by overdetermined by the idea that deconstruction is jargon or whatever, but it does have a fundamental set of issues, and it's really a good article for discussing the difference between Heidegger talking about destruction or destruction and what deconstruction is in this particular context. And yes, it even tackles, I think, some of the misperceptions that have come about from this. And there's other issues that are at work here as well. Other people who would incorporate deconstruction into their theory building um, have tended not to quote Derrida that much, but in fact they were doing Derridian activity, which is, I think, really important. So anyway, I'll stop there. I've already yacked far too much, and I've reached the end of my time period. So let me see if there were any brickbats or whatever in the chat. I don't know. I watched Deconstructing Harry, and I don't think it really is about deconstruction. But anyway, that's another story. Yes, aporias are actually important because they are puzzles, but they also are gaps. That's the other meaning for aporia. So, and I think and aporia in that context relates to alterity, which I put a little thing in there on. But anyway, so that's kind of where that fits. Young Frankenstein.
Well, I'll just say that I've dealt with deconstruction or from a design standpoint. And, back in the 90s, Derrida and Daniel Libeskind, when he was still
Oh, yes.
coming out of school. And it was, it became like very fashionable in the set design world for a while. And I probably did I did a few things that were in that world, but without really understanding it from a theoretical point of view, other than taking, literally taking a form and exploding it, or you know rendering it from various points of view at once in a set. So I had minimal understanding of it, but I tried to read the Derrida stuff in architectural, and I forgot what book, what publication it was. But it's just so dense, I couldn't understand it, to be perfectly honest.
Well, I don't disagree with you. It is dense, and it does have other, and Derrida himself was sort of screwing around with certain set of ideas, and he sort of liked the way that he was engaging the set of issues. And I've mentioned before, the uh, uh, there's a text that it's a conversation that John Searle, the ordinary language philosopher, he wouldn't call himself an ordinary language philosopher. He's such essentially well, he's actually technically an analytic philosopher. But anyway, he has this running argument with Derrida, and Derrida built an entire book sort of co-opting Searle's original story. So essentially, he appropriated. It's very deconstructive in that sense. He appropriated all of Searle's writing and essentially subverted the intellectual property of Searle by creating an entire book that essentially repeated word for word the Searle's original article or text, and he points this out in the book. I've gotten to the end, and now I've totally co-opted your argument by using every word that you've said. That may have been the only point of it, but
just being a jerk
in that sense.
Yeah.
The person who would reflect on that kind of deconstruction, though, is the person you were working with, the set designer. Is it Sana Pietro or I can't.
Oh,
Uh,
the Russian? No.
He does the work for Wilson as well.
Oh, right. I forgot his name, but I know what you're talking about.
And
yes, Robert Wilson's designer. Though Robert Wilson also fancies himself a designer as well. So.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, I mean,
he is.
So but I would assert that some of those kinds of things are the things that I would assert that, for example, said the Catherine wheel is a deconstructive text. It's
well,
really,
you're the Catherine wheel, yeah, that's Santo Laquasto, who's actually a friend of mine.
Right. So, and I would assert that he's engaging in a kind of deconstructive.
Yeah, I don't know if he would. I'm not sure he would say that.
Oh, but yeah, he probably would. He would
probably
say,
"Oh no, Twyla just wanted a big wheel on stage, and he wanted these verticals, and we wanted to." I mean, he would have a very simple thing. But you mentioned that, and actually, that's what I would like to show. That there's a video of it. You can watch the whole thing. And for those of you who don't know, this is a dance piece, a full sort of extended evening dance piece choreographed by Twyla Tharp, and the music is written by David Byrne of the Talking Heads.
David Byrne.
And it's pretty extraordinary, actually. It was done at BAM. It was done in a bunch of different places, but But there is a video of it. You can watch it. Maybe.
It's worth watching. We should
Yeah,
also
all right. Maybe
watch
I'll
it
show it.
together.
Yeah.
So I think it fits into that. Well, anyway, we go at length about that. Let me end the live stream and then end the share. Thank you very much, all, for putting up with my yammering here. I didn't get close to the end, and I may talk about the deconstruction thing because it's relatively intelligible next week.